Okay, this week we're looking at what's called strain theory, and in particular we're looking at this guy here, R.K. Merton. Okay. Now, some of you may be familiar with strain theory, some of you may be familiar with R.K. Merton, particularly those of you that have got a background in sociology will be familiar with R.K. Merton's work. Before we go on to look at Merton in a bit more detail, we'll do what we do each week. We'll try to draw some connections between what we're looking at this week and what we've looked at in previous weeks, okay? Because what we look at this week builds very much on what we looked at last week when we looked at structural functionalism, when we looked at Emile Durkheim, okay? Before I go on to outline to you the key points, you tell me, what were the key points that we discussed last week when we looked at Durkheim's work? What were the points that we really took away from last week's lecture? So, because this follows on in many ways. What were the key points from Durkheim? What did we learn from Durkheim? In what way was Durkheim's approach a radical departure from all that we've looked at previous? Do you remember that we've looked at classicism, we've looked at positivism, and we said that positivism is split into two. You've got individual, you've got sociological, individual, biological, and psychological. And this is what we're looking at now, isn't it? We're looking at forms of sociological positivism, and this strain theory is a form of sociological positivism. But what were the key points that we took away from last week's lecture? Were there any?
Durkheim believed that crime was like a function, it formed its own kind of function of society.
Right, he says that crime is functional, didn't he? He said that when we look at social phenomena, when we seek to understand things, we can understand them at a societal level. We can look at these external forces, these external factors that exist outside of the individual to try to find explanations. And he used his great study of suicide, didn't he, in order to illustrate this. Okay, now, towards the end of the lecture, I said that Durkheim said that at the heart of all societies are these shared values, morals and beliefs. Okay? Now this is something that R.K. Merton takes. He takes this idea that there is at the centre of society a kind, he doesn't use the term that Durkheim uses. Durkheim uses the term collective conscience or conscience collective. But Durkheim says that at the heart of all societies there is this sense of solidarity. Now, do you remember I said to you that the form of that solidarity changes? He said that there are different types of solidarity. There is, anyone remember? Okay, organic solidarity and mechanic solidarity. Okay, brilliant. Now, he said then that in pre-modern societies, in societies characterised by mechanical solidarity, he said that the collective conscience is well defined. Okay. He said that these societies tend to be homogeneous societies, so there's a very highly defined sense of what is right and what is wrong. Okay, so people have this very clear sense of identity, if you like. In modern societies, he says that the Industrial Revolution brings about a forced division of labour. That's the term that he uses. It brings about a forced division of labour. And he says that the collective conscience, the solidarity, changes from mechanic to a form of organic solidarity. And he said that this is much more heterogeneous, it's much more diverse, much more plural. Now, he says this for a reason. He says that in modern societies, in industrial societies, these industrial societies are likely to have higher rates of crime and criminality. Okay? Why does he say that? What's the explanation that he gave? Why are modern industrial societies more likely to be criminogenic according to Durkheim?
Because they're more diverse.
Because they're more diverse. What's the term that he uses? He says that...
Fragmentation.
Sorry?
Fragmentation.
Societies become fragmented, yes. So why is it then that crime rates are more likely to be higher than in pre-modern societies? What is it about that fragmentation? What is it about that breakup then? What's the term that he uses to describe a situation where crime becomes dysfunctional? Anomic. Brilliant, excellent, brilliant, yes. Right. He uses term called anomie, doesn't he? This is Durkheim. Now, what Merton does is he takes this concept of anomie and he develops it. Okay, so we can see parallels, we can see connections between R.K. Merton's work and Durkheim's work. And certainly, R.K. Merton's work is a form of sociological positivism. Okay, so he's looking for explanations for social phenomena outside of the individual. Okay, he's looking for these kind of to reveal these universal laws. Okay, is that making some sense so far? Okay, so we're drawing connections between last week's session and today's session. So, strain theory then is a form of sociological positivism. Okay, looking for explanations outside of the individual. Good. Okay, right, that makes sense then. Right, now before we go on to look at what Merton says in greater detail, what must we do? Before we look at his theory, what must we do? We must.
See the context.
Who's speaking? Thank you. We must. Say it
See
again.
the context.
Look at the context. Brilliant. Right. So why do we look at the context?
To understand
To.
understand the theory.
Okay. So by understanding the context in which a theory is situated, we understand the drivers of that theory, don't we? Okay, so theory doesn't emerge in a vacuum, it exists in a context. Understand the context and it will help us to understand the theory. Good, right. So if you know the context in which R.K. Merton is writing. Has anyone heard of Merton before? Just give me an idea, put your hand up if you've heard of Merton. Okay, a couple of you, some of you, some I'm going to say. Okay, where was he writing? What period was he writing? You were going to say, Holly? You weren't.
1920.
Brilliant. 1920s. Where? Any idea where?
In the US.
Where?
In the US.
US, brilliant. Okay, in the United States, right. Okay, now what do we know about 1920s America? What's the context then? What sort of things are happening? Brilliant. Okay, right. So we had firstly then the Great Depression. What was the Great Depression? What was the Great Depression? What is a depression? Anyone know? It's. Speak. I can't hear.
A time of no jobs, like.
Time of no jobs, huge unemployment. Okay, Wall Street had crashed, doesn't it? So there was a huge problem in terms of the economy in America. It was a huge problem. Wall Street had crashed. The value of the US dollar had plummeted. Huge unemployment. Literally, people trying to sell their goods, their possessions, but nobody wanted to buy them. Nobody had the money to buy them. Things became worthless. Huge unemployment. Huge discontent. Huge poverty. Okay, this was a really tumultuous period in American history. Okay, so huge unemployment and huge discontent. We had the Great Depression then. What else was happening in America during this period? Any ideas? What else do we associate 1920s America with? The other thing that was happening in 1920s America was organised crime. There was an explosion of organised crime during this period. This is like the kind of Al Capone era. Okay, gangs of men walking around with violin cases with machine guns in them. So organised crime was occurring during this period, and organised crime was particularly linked to this, the Volstead Acts. Does anyone know what the Volstead Acts were? You do?
Alcohol.
It was?
Is it ban of alcohol?
Prohibition, yeah. This was the act in America that prohibited the sale and consumption of alcohol, the Volstead Acts. So, in many ways, the Volstead Acts, prohibition, really fueled organised crime. Okay, so if you couldn't get hold of alcohol legally, then you got hold of it illegally through organised crime. So, this then is the context. 1920s America, Great Depression, huge levels of unemployment, organised crime seemingly out of control during this period. Mobsters basically in positions of power. This was a period in which lots of things were happening that were seen to be problematic. That's the context, okay? Now, as we've said then, the context informs the theory, okay? What kind of conclusions, let's just, if I present you with the context, what kind of conclusions do you think you might draw from this in terms of trying to understand levels of crime? Because crime in 1920s America was doing something like this. It was going up like this. Okay, so it's seen as being problematic. Okay? So, what connections can you draw between that and an explanation? What would you think? What would you say, given this context? Any thoughts? What's your thoughts? Yeah.
There's a high level of crime rates, like people commit a lot of crimes.
But why?
Because of a huge level of unemployment.
So unemployment leads to crime? Kind of. It's actually not what he said. He didn't say unemployment leads to crime. He's looking at other factors, other social factors. I mean, I think you're perfectly entitled to draw that as a conclusion. And there's a whole body of work that looks at the relationship between unemployment and crime. A lot of it is contested, in fact, in terms of what it actually says. R.K. Merton's looking at this, okay, he's looking at the context, and from this he draws a number of conclusions. Okay, and his starting point there is to take Durkheim's concept of anomie. Okay, now firstly, what is anomie in the Durkheimian sense? What does anomie mean? Right, okay, it's a breakdown of norm, values and beliefs, a sense of normlessness, isn't it? So normlessness. Right, he says then that if crime rates become too high or they become too low, we get a situation called anomie, okay, a sense of normlessness. Why does he say that? Well, he says that if crime rates become too high, then you're actually threatening the very existence of the collective conscience. You're threatening the fabric of society that holds it together. So he says that there needs to be a healthy amount of crime, doesn't it? Because crime helps societies to adapt and it helps society to evolve. He says that if crime rates become too low, that can also become anomic. He said it becomes unhealthy. Remember, he uses the analogy of a plant, doesn't he? So he says, also then, if crime rates become too low, you're not actually crime is not bringing about social change. There's not enough crime to test the boundaries, to move society forward, to advance it. So society becomes anomic. Now what Merton does is, he looks at this concept and he provides us with a less abstract explanation. Okay? So he looks at the concept and he uses it and kind of reinvents it. So Merton's concept is less abstract and it's less extreme. What Merton says is, he says that anomie, okay, this is the key point, anomie, this sense of normlessness, does not affect all groups in the same way. It doesn't affect all groups in the same way. He said, for example, that, if you look at criminality, then this sense of normlessness, if crime rates are too high or they're too low, when crime rates become too high, for example, who is it that's committing the crime? This is the vast majority of it being committed by poor working class people. So he says that anomie does not affect all groups in the same way, which is what you might expect under a Durkheimian analysis. He says that in order to understand how this breakdown occurs, or the impact of this breakdown, we need to understand how it affects different groups. Is this making sense? So anomie doesn't affect all groups in the same way. So what does he do then? Well, he says that, remember we said that he takes a few of Durkheim's concepts. He says that at the heart of all societies are these shared values, morals and beliefs then. Okay, in the same way that Durkheim sees a collective conscience. And he says that in all societies there are what he calls, let's call them ends. There are ends and there are means. Okay? Ends and there are means. He says that all societies have culturally defined ends, culturally defined ends. And what he does is he draws from a classic American example, and he says that in America there is what he calls the American dream. The American dream. Now the American dream is at the heart of American culture. The American dream. Now the American dream consists of very clearly defined things, doesn't it? So what is the American dream? What comes to mind when you think of the American dream? What are the components of the American dream?
Be successful. Be successful.
To be successful, but a particular form of success, isn't it? What type of success? Money. To be financially wealthy, to be wealthy, to be financially successful. So the accumulation of wealth is a culturally defined end. Okay? The accumulation of wealth. Right, what do you do with that wealth? Well, you do things like, you buy your big house in Beverly Hills, you buy your big Cadillac, and you display your wealth, don't you? Okay? So, culturally defined ends then. The accumulation of wealth is at the heart of the American dream. Right, not only that, but the American dream isn't just about the accumulation of wealth, but it says that anyone can accumulate that wealth. Anyone. If you work hard, if you're diligent, then you can achieve that American dream. The American dream is open to us all. You might have seen recently in the newspaper, Simon Cowell. You all know who Simon Cowell is, I'm sure. Simon Cowell turned around and said about education. He said that education, why bother with education? People, to use his term, just need to get lucky. That's his term. He basically said, people just need to get lucky. So he's kind of promoting this entrepreneurial spirit. So in a way, he's kind of echoing this. Anyone can be successful. This is the mantra that's often given by these successful entrepreneurs. People like Richard Branson would talk about this. They'd say that anyone can achieve anything if you work hard and if you set your mind to it. Okay? So the American dream then is all about the accumulation of wealth, but more importantly, underpinning that is this notion of egalitarianism. Egalitarianism. So this notion then that anyone can achieve it. We're all kind of equal to achieve this American dream. So immigrants in America, if they work hard, they can achieve the American dream. So there are culturally defined ends, which is the American dream. But he says, and this is really important, he says that there are institutionally accepted means of achieving these culturally defined goals. Institutionally accepted means of achieving these culturally defined goals. What does he mean by that then? Well, he says that there are institutionally accepted means. So, to achieve the American dream, how do you achieve it then? You
work hard and do it through the
What's the form of that work? Well, the form of that work is through recognised institutions. So really, in many ways, most of you here are embracing the American dream in many ways, or the ideas of the American dream, because you're thinking, well, I'm going to get an education. This is an institutionally accepted means, isn't it, of achieving success. So you work hard at college, you get good A-levels. Once you've got your good A-levels, you go to a good university, you get, whilst you're at that university, you work hard, you get a good degree. Your reward for getting a good degree is a future employer will employ you. Your future employer will give you a range of tasks to do. If you work hard and you achieve, and you actually manage to achieve those ends, those requirements, you get promoted. Your hard work is recognised. You're promoted, so you're given more responsibility. More responsibility, what comes with that? More money, more wealth. So gradually you're accumulating more and more wealth through these institutionally accepted means of achieving these culturally defined ends. Okay? So this is at the heart of American society, according to R.K. Merton. Is making sense? Okay, so institutionally accepted means of achieving these culturally defined ends. But that's clear then. Now, what Merton does is he says that at certain moments in time in history, if there's too much emphasis placed on the ends without the sufficient means, institutionally accepted means of achieving these ends, this can lead to what he calls strain. This is why it's called strain theory. This leads to strain. So if societies put too much emphasis on the ends of achieving the accumulation of wealth without providing sufficient means of achieving those ends, that leads to strain, societal strain. And he says that when strain occurs, groups form adaptations. There are a number of adaptations to this strain when it occurs.
Mark, what did you say? When does the strain occur?
Sorry?
When does the strain occur?
Strain occurs when there is too much emphasis placed on ends, on the culturally defined ends, without providing the institutionally accepted means of achieving these ends. Let me give you an example, just so we're clear about this point before we move on. Do you remember in August 2011 that there were a number of riots in London and in other parts of the country? Okay, can you remember how what was actually happening with riots? What was actually happening? What form did the riots take? Can anyone remember?
Was it Mark Duggan's killing, like the shooting?
Yeah, it was. Mark Duggan was shot by the police, wasn't he? And that was the spark. But really, that spark kind of ignited seething discontent that had been in existence for a number of years, really. But the riots manifested themselves in a particular type of way. What were the rioters actually doing? I know it's like a couple of years ago now, so it kind of seems like an age away to some of you. But it didn't manifest. There was something peculiar, something particular about those riots.
They're not rebelling against the police.
Well, a riot is basically a form of protest, isn't it? But the form of that protest took a particularly different way, something that we haven't really seen, certainly for the last 15 years or so. What were the rioters actually doing? They were looting, weren't they? Where were they looting? They were looting. What types of shops though? They weren't looting Tesco's and places like that. They were looting. Speak up. Where were they looting?
Electronics.
Where?
Worries.
They were stealing things like mobile phones, weren't they? Electrical hardware shop. They were breaking into places like JD Sports to nick trainers. Right, what was going on here is they were stealing these kind of, if you like, luxury goods. Okay, they were trying to meet these kind of learned needs. They weren't stealing food, were they? They weren't like starving people. They were stealing things that we don't really need. They were kind of stealing these kind of white goods, these kind of luxury goods. These kind of items that we're told that we actually need to be accepted. So things like mobile phones. How many of you upgrade your mobile phone because it's the latest version of the phone and you're a bit embarrassed about your naff old phone? Many of us do that, don't we? Because it's important that you've got the latest technology because you don't want to be seen out of place. How many of you have bought new trainers because your old trainers are somehow kind of last season's fashions? Most of you, when you buy clothes, you're buying clothes because it was last season's fashion. So we don't need these things. We're told that we need them. So these are culturally defined ends. If we're not provided with the means of achieving these ends then, okay, so what are the institutionally accepted means of achieving these ends? What's the legitimate way of achieving these ends? What do we ordinarily do?
Work.
We get a job, don't we? So we work. We get paid a wage, and with that wage, we can then purchase these items, which gives us that sense of belonging, that sense of attachment. Yeah? But if there isn't sufficient means, i.e. sufficient jobs in order to achieve those culturally defined ends, you get strain. Okay? So this is what he's talking about here then. He's saying that if far too much emphasis is placed on the ends without appropriate means of achieving those ends, that leads to strain, societal strain, which then in turn leads to adaptations. Right, okay. Hopefully this is making some sense. Right, I'm going to move this up a little bit. So that leads to strain, which in turn leads to these adaptations. Now he says, there are a variety of different adaptations. He says that the most common adaptation is what he calls conformity, which isn't really an adaptation at all. Conformity means then that, so here are the ends and here are the means. Right, so here are the ends and here are the means. Right, so if strain occurs, the most common type of adaptation, he says, is conformity. This is where people accept the ends and also the means of achieving them. So they kind of just go along with it. Okay, you accept the ends and the means. Okay, so you kind of just conform. So you just basically keep playing the game. Okay, so you're trying to accumulate wealth by the institutional means that are accepted. Okay, so you just keep on playing the game. The second adaptation he calls innovation. Now this is the one that's really important for us as criminologists. He says that this is where groups accept the ends, culturally defined ends, but not the institutionally accepted means of achieving those ends. So what do they do then? So you've got this desire to want to accumulate wealth, but you're not going to do it through the legitimate means. Okay, so this is all about legitimate means. Okay, so what are the illegitimate means of achieving these ends then? Crime. So you adapt then, you commit criminality. Okay? So you go out and you steal, but you still accept the ends, but you choose these illegitimate mechanisms of achieving those ends. Okay, so you innovate. Now, do you remember I said right at the start, at the outset, that what Merton does that Durkheim doesn't do is that he provides us with a kind of a class analysis. He says that these adaptations, the way he says that strain or anomie doesn't affect all groups in the same way. Do you remember when we said that? Well, he says that, Merton says that this adaptation, innovation, is more likely to be the response of the working classes. So he provides us with that explanation for why it seems that criminality is located in the working classes. He says that because these people are more likely to innovate. Why? Why are these people more likely or more inclined to innovate than, say, middle class people? Why do you think he might say that?
They haven't got the means.
They're more likely not to have the means, yes. But there's another reason as well. It's to do with how we acquire these culturally defined ends, and importantly, how we acquire these institutionally accepted means of achieving these ends. How do we acquire this? How do we know? How do we learn the American dream? How do we learn this notion? You know, was there ever any time, a class that you had in school, where your teacher sat you down and said, right, these are your culturally defined ends. You need to work hard, you need to accumulate wealth, this is how we achieve it. No, it doesn't work like that, does it? How does it work? Norms and values, what do you mean by these norms and values there? Right, the way you're socialised then, isn't it? Okay, now, we learn these values through this process of socialisation. Okay, you don't learn them necessarily in a lesson in school. These are things that you're told by your parents, a sense of right and wrong and what you value and what you shouldn't value. Okay, and they're very unique to different countries. We have the Western values, don't we? Scandinavia has slightly different kind of norms and values. But we learn this through a process of socialisation. How does this then affect the working classes? Why is it that working classes are more likely then to adapt to a form of innovation by committing crime? What is it about socialisation then?
They're not socialised in the same way. They're not socialised in the same way.
Okay, so socialisation is less powerful with the working classes. The working classes then are less socialised. They're less inclined to hold all of these values. So they're more likely to think that innovation is something that's acceptable. Okay, so the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate is less highly defined. How many of you in this room have been offered something that's fallen off the back of a lorry? How many of you have been offered stuff that's been fallen off the back of a lorry? Most of you would have been offered stuff that's fallen. Well, we know that falling off the back of a lorry is a euphemism for a lorry somewhere or a shop that's been broken into by somebody and items have been stolen, but somehow we sanitise it and that it's falling off the back of a lorry. It kind of makes it harmless then, doesn't it? Well, many of us, particularly working class people, crime and criminality is kind of normalised. Many of us have been offered things, a laptop, a phone, that is kind of, its origins are of shady, unknown origin, okay? Handbags that are kind of Gucci handbags that are not Gucci handbags. How many of us have experienced that? Well, all of us, headscarves, Gucci headscarves that aren't actually Gucci headscarves. We've all encountered this. Now, the idea is that the working classes are less likely to have that distinction between illegitimate and legitimate. So, if you're less inculcated in terms of these legitimate institutional means and accepting these ends, you're more likely to deviate and argue. You're more inclined to choose these innovative ways of achieving these culturally defined ends. So this is more likely to be a response. So what Durkheim does here then, exceptionally, I think he does this quite well, is he provides us with an explanation of why criminality seems to occur or be located at the working classes. Now we know this is problematic in itself, I'm sure you do. Right, because we know that crime is ubiquitous, it's everywhere, isn't it? But we'll come back to that when we look at the evaluations of this in the seminar. The other response that Merton refers to is what he calls ritualism. Ritualism is another adaptation to strain. Now this is where let's get this right. This is where the ends, so the means are accepted, but the ends are rejected. So these are people that basically kind of ritualise. They just go along with it. Okay, so they go along with the means, so they're still very highly inculcated, they're still kind of going along with the institutional means. They don't really have any kind of prospect or any real kind of desire to want to achieve the American dream. They know that they're never going to have the big house in Beverly Hills. Okay, so the cultural goals are almost forgotten, but the means are accepted. Okay, so he says that this is the response of the lower middle classes. He said this is most likely to be the adaptation that lower middle classes are likely to turn to. Why? Well, because they're so highly well socialised that they're going to be less inclined to choose illegitimate means of achieving these ends. So the way I tend to think about this is your typical kind of middle management. So your middle manager who knows that they're never going to have like a massive great big house in Mayfair, but they just kind of go along with the game anyway. Okay, so they ritualise, everything's routine. They'll still go to work 9 till 5 for 30 years, knowing that they're never going to really achieve these ends. So they're ritualised, they go along with it, it's a ritual to them. Another adaptation that Merton refers to is what's called retreatism. Retreatists reject both ends and the means. So the retreatists are people like drug addicts, for example. They drop out of the race. They're the tramps, the vagrants, drug addicts. So they kind of retreat from society. They reject both the ends and the means of achieving them. Okay, they are societal dropouts. The final adaptation that Merton refers to is what he calls rebellion. This is the final adaptation that flows from strain. This is where groups change the means and the ends. Okay, so they replace the ends and the means with new culturally defined ends and means. So this is a kind of non-conformist category, a revolutionary, rebellious category. Now, these reactions that Merton's referring to here are not mutually exclusive. Okay, they are merely broad categories for analysis. It's really important that we understand that. They're ideal types, they're ways of seeing. Okay, so not all working class people are going to turn to innovation. For example, you know, a lot of working class people are still going to conform. You're still going to find some working class people that are going to be ritualised. They're going to go to work in their factory job and just keep on doing that, keep playing the game. Okay, without really having any aspirations to achieving this American dream. So these are ways of seeing, modes of analysis. Okay, they're ways of seeing how there's a very different distribution of crime in American society. Okay, is this making some sense to you? Yeah. So what Merton does is then he adapts, he develops R.K. Merton's position, he develops Durkheim's position. He takes the concept of anomy and he provides it with a less abstract explanation. He says that we can understand this disjuncture between means and ends, and that's what he's referring to here. This is the other word. Rather than using adaptation, we can call it a disjuncture. This is where there's too much emphasis placed on that and not enough on that. Okay? So importantly then, what we're saying here is that discontent, well, this is a really important point, that discontent, which is manifested in crime, this is what we're talking about here, the crime or discontent manifests itself as crime. Discontent relates to not absolute deprivation, but relative deprivation. Discontent or criminality relates to not to absolute deprivation, but to relative. Do you know the difference? What is absolute deprivation? Any ideas?
Like deprived of everything.
Of your basic needs, so food, shelter, warmth, these sort of things. What's relative deprivation then?
You're not really deprived of things you need, it's more things you want, like the
Things that we're told that we need, really, in many ways. So, for example, these young kids that were rioting in the August 2011 riots weren't rioting because they were starving. That wasn't the reason. They were rioting because of a whole range of reasons, obviously. But one of the reasons was that they probably felt relatively deprived. That they didn't feel as though they had the same stake in society as the rest of us. So if you don't feel as though you've got the same stake in society, you're going to be more inclined to say, well, sod you then, well, I'm going to break the law. And that can manifest itself in a whole range of different ways, not just stealing from a shop, but it can mean graffitiing on the wall, for example. If you don't feel you have any sense of belonging to an area, why should you care about it? You have to break some windows, graffiti the walls. Who cares? Nobody cares about you, you don't care about them. So, discontent then relates to absolute, it doesn't relate to absolute, but it relates to relative deprivation then. It's a key difference. Now, this is also a point that's made by Jock Young, okay, but he uses different terminology and slightly different explanations. He calls this the bulimic society. B-U-L-I-M-I-C, bulimic. What is bulimia? What is bulimia? Anyone?
an eating disorder.
It's an eating disorder. What form does that eating disorder take?
Isn't it when you eat and you make yourself sick?
It's where you purge, isn't it? So you'll eat loads and loads of sweets, for example, and then you'll purge your body. You make yourself sick in whatever variety, whatever way that might take, so fingers down throat or whatever. So Jock Young uses this term, the bulimic society. He says that what happens is in many Western countries have this mantra of inclusion. We're all included, But whilst it's saying that we're all included, at the same time, it spits out, it vomits out certain groups, it excludes certain groups. This is a quote from Jock Young, okay, when he's talking about the bulimic society. He says that we have a society which choruses the mantra of liberty, equality and fraternity, yet systematically, in the job market, on the streets, in day-to-day contact with the outside world, practices exclusion. Okay? We have a society which choruses the mantra of liberty, equality and fraternity, yet systematically in the job market, on the streets, in day-to-day contact with the outside world, practices exclusion. So we have a society then, okay, which choruses the mantra of liberty, equality and fraternity. So we have everyone's equal, everyone has the same ability to achieve these ends. Play the game, play the game. Yet at the same time in the job market, on the streets, in day-to-day contact, practices exclusion. So not everyone is provided with the means of achieving these ends. So society is bulimic then, it purports to be inclusive, yet at the same time it vomits out sections of the community. You're not going to be part of this. So the superficial message then is that everyone is included, but structural factors vomit out a considerable part of it. Well, let's pause and consider this then, because this is pretty powerful stuff. So he's saying then that structural factors, that's why this becomes then sociological positivism, because he's looking at structural forces. He's not looking at why Joe Bloggs has committed a crime. He's looking at these structural forces that exist outside of individuals, okay, that individuals or groups are powerless against. So structural forces. So what kind of structural forces then would prohibit certain groups from achieving these ends? Well,
so I don't really understand that believing bit. So everyone has an equal chance, but in reality they don't.
yeah, so society choruses this mantra of inclusion. Everyone, right, we're all in this together. You've all heard this recently perhaps with the Conservative Party and the coalition government. We're all in this together, okay, so we all knuckle down, we all pay higher taxes in order to pay back this debt, but then if you think about it, so if we raise taxes by 10%, for example, 10% of my wages is going to be a lot less in real terms than 10% of your wages in terms of the impact it's going to have. Do you understand? So, we're not all in this together. So if for example, you do raise taxes by 10%, if you earn £1,000 a week, what's that? That's £100. Now, if you earn £100 a week, 10% of that is, right, but that £10, although it's still the same 10%, is going to have more impact on this person than this person, isn't it? So, what we're saying here is that society choruses this mantra of inclusion, that we're all in this together, we have these values, these morals and beliefs that we all should aspire to, yet no one, or certain groups, are structurally excluded from that. Let's think about this then. Let's think about the implications. Right, how many of you know people that have an Oxbridge education, been to Oxford and Cambridge? Anyone? Right, did they get a first?
I think so.
Yes, they did, of course they did. You said yes? Yeah, and you look at these people, you think, wow, these are really intelligent people, they got a first from Oxford. Well, the vast majority of people that go to Oxford and Cambridge, I think something like 60% come out with a first. But we always think, oh, they've got a first from Cambridge, they must be super, super bright. Who are these people that are Oxford and Cambridge? What's their backgrounds?
Middle classes.
Right, well, they tend to be people disproportionately, anyway, disproportionately white, disproportionately very wealthy, and disproportionately privately educated. Okay, so when I look at a student, if I look at a student or two people, if I was an employer, and I looked at somebody from a poor background, somebody who lives in Tower Hamlets, I don't know, say first or second generation immigrants who come out of the university with a 2-1, a kind of an old school, like a new university, like a post-92 university, and you compare that to somebody that gets a first from Cambridge, who's had a privately educated background, you can't compare the two, can you? Because one's had a very privileged background and the other one hasn't. Who's achieved the most? So I'd suggest to you that it's probably the person from Tower Hamlets who's a second generation immigrant that's done well to get a 2-1. We expect, if you pour money into somebody and you invest money into somebody, in the same way that some middle class people do with their children, it's not surprising that they come out of Oxford with a first. You wouldn't expect anything less, would you? So, do we all have the same starting point here then? No, this is the problem, isn't it? So some groups then are structurally excluded from playing this game. Some people have the cards stacked against them from the outset. Okay? And this is what Merton's saying here. He's saying it's these people that have the cards stacked against them that are more likely to choose these illegitimate means of achieving these culturally defined ends by using these adaptations. This is where this disjuncture comes into play then. This is making sense. I think this stuff is pretty intuitive because we can relate to it. Okay, right. Let's try and summarise this then and make sense of what Merton's seeking to do. He's seeking to do a couple of things. He's trying to understand crime from this kind of structural level. So we can understand crime not by these individual explanations why somebody might be motivated to commit crime individually, but we're looking at how structural forces, unemployment, for example, how if we put too much emphasis on culturally defined ends, how that can create discontent if people don't have the means of achieving them, and how people adapt as a consequence. So, the way to think about this is like this, and this is an analogy that's provided by Taylor, Wharton and Young. Okay, I'm sure none of you in this room probably remembers this kind of fruit machines. Does anyone remember fruit machines? Anyone been to Clacton on Brighton on holiday? You got fruit machines? Do you remember them? Yeah, you've got a Sega generation, aren't you? A PlayStation generation. Some of you, does this analogy sort of work for you? Do you know what I'm talking about? Fruit machine. Right, fruit machine is like you put your money in there, you pull the handle, and these kind of swing round. If you get free cherries, you
I know what you're talking about now.
You do now. You know what I mean now. Right, so imagine this then. This is the system. Okay, the system, and you're all playing this system. Okay, all of you now are literally putting your money in there. How much are you paying for your fees? 7,000. Is that each year? Wow.
Yeah.
Well, okay, £7,000. There you go, in there. Okay, so you pull that. Okay, and what comes out here then? Well, the end is degree, isn't it? That's what you get. And hopefully, apparently, you will have to have a 2-1, don't you?
Yeah.
It's an absolute requirement. You have to have a 2-1. Right, so there you are. Then you're playing your machine. Okay, you're putting the money in the machine. Right, so why are you doing this then? Well, because you think that basically by playing this machine, putting your money in there, you've got a chance of hitting the jackpot, okay, coming out with a 2-1. Okay, that's basically the idea of it. So there's culturally defined ends and means all in here, isn't it? You're playing the game. You're not doing something that's not culturally defined. You're not just basically setting up on your own and kind of going out and committing crime and stuff like this, are you? You're playing the game. You're playing the game. Now, there's a problem with this, isn't there? What's the problem with it?
Nothing's guaranteed. Nothing's guaranteed at the end.
Nothing's guaranteed. There is something that's guaranteed. There's one thing that's guaranteed from this.
Be in debt?
Yes, that's not what I'm thinking of. Who's the real winner here?
The machine.